As a writer, poet, and also a Black history educator, when I've got the time, the story of the Liverpool Race Riots of 1919 is always one that I found surprises present day audiences when I tell them about it. In one of England's oldest Black communities, that Professor John Belchem, on the blurb of his book Before the Windrush, remarks Liverpool for its polyglot populations, its boisterous sailor town and cosmopolitan profile of transient sojourners and settlers, and it was here that Black colonials arriving in the city following the First World War, albeit their British status, would learn that there really ain't no black in the Union Jack. And I first visited the city as a boy of 10, going to the Slave Trade Museum with my paternal grandparents, who were born in Jamaica themselves, but grew up in Britain as part of the Windrush generation. I've loved that place ever since, albeit only visiting the city a handful of times. However, the primary rationale for this approach to my dissertation, looking at a specific year, was originally inspired by episode 4 of the groundbreaking documentary series Black and British, Homecoming, the episode entitled Homecoming, where historian Professor David Olusoga and some local Liverpudlians memorialised Charles Wootton, a victim of the race riots of 1919, with a plaque at Queen's Dock, with Leeds Beckett's own Dr. Rachel Boyle, also in attendance. However, since the 2016 series, I was also moved along to look at 1919, following the murder of George Floyd, where racism was still being treated as an American issue. In July 2020, I was interviewed by a Guardian journalist called Amna Modin on Black Lives Matter, along with many other Black Britons across the country. The resources being circulated as anti-racism texts at the time were useful, but also very American. When looking at the history of racism, I found people in the UK using American history or the American context as if it was relevant to the history or the context of the UK as well, which is a very different story, out of the gaze of Jim Crow laws, for example. It's not that this history isn't important, but it does not really speak to the distinctness of British racism here in the UK. So my rationale was in response to racism being treated as an American problem, but also that so-called universal history of specifically anti-Black racism being American, and how Black history is still a very Americanized concept in the UK. Why do we learn about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, but not the Bristol bus boycott, pioneered by members of the Windrush generation reacting to the racism or the institutional racism in Bristol bus services? My rationale also comes from coming into my own knowledge of my own mixed race heritage. I always knew there were people in my family tree that were mixed race, but I did not expect to find that in as recent as my grandmother, herself the granddaughter of a white man, along with her nine or so siblings. Nobody told me this growing up. However, 2020 was a turbulent year, and for many, with the colliding a turbulent year for many, with the colliding pandemics of the coronavirus and then the revisiting of racist policing, um, through the lynching of yet another Black person by police. This time, George Floyd streamed into the smart devices worldwide, resulting in the biggest anti-racist demonstration in the history of in the human story, and then the biggest court case, probably since O.J. Simpson. And today, mixed race people, I talked about, as Selena Godden puts it, like love bombs planted into the minefield of black and white. Yet England has had black and mixed race populations going back centuries. Their existence often provoking a xenophobia amongst homogenously white communities. So my dissertation aims to be part historical study and part autoethnography. I want to use the race riots of 1919 in Liverpool to show the precedent that Black Lives Matter has in Britain, making the case that it should be part of the national school curriculum. Using my experiences as part of the BLM movement and protests as a catalyst, I want to show a side of British racism I was thinking about at the time of the murder of George Floyd. Another year, another lynching. We have marked a lot of 100-year anniversaries, including 1914, so 2014 for the start of the war, 2016 marking 100 years since the Somme, and then 2018 marking 100 years since the end of the war. Many of us know lots of the stories about contemporary racial violence, but there is another set of stories taking place in another year about a century prior. In 2019, we did not mark 100 years, the 100-year anniversary since those race riots, a year when black soldiers returned from fighting the war to end all wars and were not included in the victory parade in London, a year of race riots where a black man was lynched on the streets of Liverpool. The year history forgot, 1919, is a year where a black man was lynched by a white mob, fitting into a historical context of British racism that isn't taught in school, but should be. Furthermore, what happened in Liverpool happened in other communities like Cardiff, Barry, and Glasgow. In short, I intend to write a dissertation or a thesis through an autoethnographic gaze of the BLM movement to discuss 1919 and the events that followed a British lynching of a black veteran, making the case for its implementation on the national school curriculum in how we teach World War I, which up until now has done a good job of showing a very unraced view of that conflict. How is it a world war without talking about it in a racialized context? I chose autoethnography to center my perspectives as someone that was part of the Black Lives Matter resurgence last summer in the national conversation, but also someone that has taught Black history to diversities of audiences, and also because, frankly, I did not want to interview anyone. This is emotional labor, and I did not want to put that onus on people during a pandemic. My first degree was in creative writing, so I hope I can also use some of those skills on my postgraduate dissertation, which is all about 1919 and the race riots, and my undergraduate was a series of essays on race, identity, and Englishness. My research questions also come in response to an anti-racism public discourse that continues to talk about racism in the UK without any historical context. We cannot talk about racism in this country without looking at what came before, including events like the race riots in Liverpool in 1919, which also had an impact of how race was seen outside of Britain as well. Methodology. The paradigm that underpins this project will be a critical paradigm. However, I'm also considering going without a paradigm as a way to decolonize my practice. If we are to take research seriously within the academy, we must consider how paradigms play into the colonizing epistemologies we want to escape from, no? I want to create an understanding of Liverpool's black-white mixed-race history of resistance in the context of modern liberation movements to present on school curricula. I want to use autoethnography to discuss my own experiences of protest activism and the current Black Lives Matter struggle, whilst using the Liverpool Race Riots to show a precedent of political expression and violence in Britain. Political and social violence in Britain. Autoethnography is a genre of writing and research that connects the personal to the cultural, placing the self within a social context. I want to use history to talk about the present, giving it agency in an educational setting. These are the best ways to answer my research questions, because critical paradigm is designed to focus on power, inequality, and social change. And this dissertation aims to combat a social problem in education, but to the benefit of society more generally. By using my experiences, I think this will be a sound way to look at how the conditions for Black Lives Matter were also alive and kicking in 1919 Britain. It'll be a mix of self-reflection and memory, and library-based historical research, like cultural theory, ethno, and also news articles and books, graphy. Yes, secondary data will be used, so i.e. census data, for example, and potential ethical issues may include bias, so the researcher has a vested interest, and I'll also be analysing sensitive documents. I'll be close to the subject as well, so I'll have a personal vested interest there, an emotional interest, because the BLM protests are ongoing, but also the interpretation of the truth. How do I interpret the truth, and that sort of thing. In my reading, I found books that both speak to history and also our present moment, Angela Siney's Superior, The Return of Race Science, for example, does have agency historically, but it may also underpin how not just black soldiers were treated in 1919, but also how black people continue to be treated today, from police violence in our communities to business meetings, where we see examples of microaggressive behavior as well. Often, black people are still at the bottom of the so-called unwritten racial order, and we still struggle to take up the space of human being, in what Frantz Fanon called the racial epidermal schema. I've also come across Black Tommies by Liverpool's own Dr. Ray Costello, and Dropping Anchor, Setting Sail by American academic Professor Jacqueline Nassie Brown on the Black geographies of Liverpool. Professor Gaminda Bamber and colleagues in their edited book, Decolonizing University, would be useful when I go on to talk about education at the end of the thesis. And Professor Priya Mvada Gopal, who I interviewed when I was part of a panel last summer, her book, Insurgent Empire, is important in showing how decolonized peoples were not just passive victims in their homelands, but active resistors. Professor Paul Gilroy's book is useful in understanding why these black people were set upon, so why they were set upon during the riots, though not articulated outright in that book. In specifically talking about the riots, that there is an image of Britishness, and that image is white, also articulated in Afua Hirsch's book British, and also this underpins the Windrush scandal years later, following hostility to Caribbean arrival in 1948. Bell Hooks' text theorizes white people as terrorists and is applicable to the social conditions of the race riots of 1919, specifically being written about racial violence in the US. Despite being written about racial violence in the US, there is a multi-purpose application there in terms of her theory about whiteness and white terror. Jean Stefankich and Rich Delgado, along with other critical race theorists, will be useful in critiquing racism as a social problem, fundamental to both BLM and the race riots. Rennie Edo-Lodge, as well in her opening chapter, where she claims the black history she learned was very American, much like my own encounters with it at school. Richard Dyer writes about white people as just human, and this is relevant to the racism that occurred during the war and afterwards, where people that were not white always had a qualifier attached. They were not seen as British because they were not white. They were seen as space invaders to England as a white nation fantasy, to quote Hardy. This is basically this is what I intend to write about. So there's the abstract, then the intro, methodology, then a piece about why autoethnography, my literature review, and then my chapters. So I'll start by talking about before and after George Floyd and what I thought about that. And then the ethno part, so the histories of racism in Britain and the British Empire, because they're interconnected. And then the graphy bit. So the British Army colour bar, another year, another lynching, and sort of how the racism within the army, those ideologies spilled into society more generally, and also what underpinned that. So race science, and I use that term tentatively, and the academics, and how the academy upheld the work of race scientists back in the 18th and the 19th century, which then gave agency to that racism, that gave agency to those racist policies during the First World War, and then we have the race riots that came afterwards out of that. So I think it's all sort of interconnected there. And then the end, looking ahead, so Britain's brown babies, so the mixed race children that came out of relationships between Black American GIs and white British women during the Second World War, and the conclusions. Why should 1919 be part of the curriculum in education and so forth? And then acknowledgements at the end. In closing, bringing scope to these under-researched histories as a link to the present shows, as Dr. King articulated, that the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice. However, we must not get complacent. The arc will not bend by itself, and that is for us to help it on its way. This is work, it is hard, but it will benefit us all in the end, in knowing who we are and where we came from. 1919 gave rise to 58. So the 1958 race riots with Nottingham and Notting Hill, and really it is white terrorism. And then in 1974 in Lewisham, and then 81 in Brixton as well, and then 85 again in Brixton, and first 2011 with the murder of Mark Duggan and the eventual riots that came out of that, and in 2020 with the BLM protests in Britain We cannot talk about racism without first looking at the race scientists of the 18th and 19th century that underpinned the justifications for anti-blackness and thus enslavement. This went on to infest policy making in the First World War by the establishment class. This all needs to be part of how we teach the war to end all wars, which consumed the lives of millions, millions, thousands, a lot of people at least. And we have work to do, lots of work to do. And then there's some more references there. And yeah, thank you.